A very warm welcome to you, Kavita, to yet another talk at the Museum Society of Bombay, and on behalf of the chairman and trustees of CSMVS, and on behalf of the staff of CSMVS, on behalf of the members of the Museum Society and all our guests who have joined us here, and the number is going up as I speak. Thank you so much for acceding to this request. It's been a tough time, and as you said earlier, we're online, we're offline, we're hybrid, but we're going to continue with Zoom for a little longer because I think it seems to be the safest, and we're happy with this platform for the moment, and we don't have space to go back at the museum at the moment because some work is going on there. So thank you so much, Kavita. We've been looking forward to this lecture, and I'm so grateful you've been able to take time out from your college, university commitments and address us here today. I've been reading about this topic. It is really quite fascinating. I know you've done some wonderful research. The image itself that accompanies this invitation is, I can't stop short of saying it's mouth-watering. I mean, the artist, Faizullah, has captured everything. And what I like so much about it is right in the forefront. You have this beautiful pool of water and the yoginis bathing in it with such gay abandon. In that type of century, to visualize something like this, hats off to the master artist and hats off to the donor who commissioned it. And I know that you're going to tell us a lot more about it. So a few words about our dear friend, Dr. Kavita Singh. She's a professor at the School of Arts and Aesthetics of Jawaharlal Nehru University, where she teaches courses in the history of Indian painting, particularly the Mughal and Rajput schools, and the history and politics of museums. Dr. Singh has published on secularism and religiosity, fraught national identities, and the memorialization of difficult histories as they relate to museums in South Asia and beyond. She's also published essays and monographs on aspects of Mughal and Rajput painting, particularly on style as a signifying system. In 2018, she was awarded the Infosys Prize in Humanities, and I remember that occasion very well, and was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2020. A little bit about what we're going to see for those of you who are familiar and unfamiliar with this genre of painting. As the Mughal center weakened in the 18th century, the governors of former Mughal provinces assumed sovereignty in places like Bengal, Awadh, and Hyderabad. The former governors assumed sovereignty and aspired to the same splendors as their former overlords and wooed poets, musicians, artists, and all types and kinds of artisans to settle in their territories, and their territories became centers of power, wealth, and cultural achievements. And some of the most talented painters left Delhi for Lucknow, Murshidabad, or Hyderabad. The visual language that had been used to aggrandize the Mughal emperors was now used to glorify the newly established sovereigns. Paintings of the darbar scenes or hunts that were made in the Mughal successor states are barely distinguishable from Mughal precursors of previous decades. Yet certain genres of painting developed in the successor states that seem to be unique to that time and place. Most remarkable among these are the terrace scenes, of which we're going to be seeing a lot of this evening, that show endless prospects of cities, gardens, and the grand wilderness beyond. These perspectival landscapes that take the eye on a journey seem endless. This lecture is going to be a very, very close link in, Kavita calls it a deep dive into the terrace scenes with endless vistas that are associated with an artist named Faizullah, and it is his image that we have on our invitation today, to speculate on the possible meanings of the cities, the landscapes, and the details found within these intriguing paintings at a time of great political and cultural ferment. I'm not going to hark back to what's happening today. And I'm going to hand the floor over to Kavita. But before that, I'd like to thank our technical team, so ably led by Jason, Aishwarya, Mrinalini, Yashraj, and I would like to thank Professor Dr. Anita Rane Kothari, my colleague on the Museum Society and Vice Chair of the Museum Society, who will be giving the vote of thanks. So thank you everyone for joining us this evening. Really enjoy this lecture. It's an absolute treat. Thank you so much. Over to you, Kavita.
Thank you very much, Firoza, for that fabulously generous introduction. And I thank you and Dr. Anita Rane Kothari of the Museum Society for this very kind invitation to come and speak to your group over here. It's always a pleasure and a privilege to do anything that's connected with this fabulous institution that we all jointly celebrate. I'm happy to plunge into today's talk. Before I do that, I want to, of course, thank Jason, and I want to thank the rest of the technical team who has done so much to put this together. And I want to thank all of you who have taken time out to listen to me speaking about some not very well-known paintings, but paintings that I hope you'll agree by the end of this talk deserve to be better known and more fully discussed. So I'm going to offer what is a deep dive into these paintings, as Firoza said, and at the same time, it's going to be a kind of a preliminary exploration, because these are not paintings about which a great deal of documentary information exists. And it's not from a period about which I am very deeply knowledgeable. But these are paintings that really, really intrigued me. And I wanted to share with you some images, and I wanted to raise some questions about them, and I wanted to make some speculations about how we might answer these questions. Let me just start by showing you the kind of painting that I got excited by. You've already seen a little glimpse of it in the invitation. But when we see these paintings, I think you will sympathize with me when I say that they were just too fascinating to not be drawn in by them and to not want to explore them. Now, the museum that owns this painting that we are looking at currently has given it the title Entertainment in a Palace. It's a painting that shows an incredible vista. In the foreground, we see a princess sitting on a golden seat. She's smoking a hookah while she's being ministered to by a host of attendants. And she's watching an entertainer. And the entertainer is performing a dance which involves a feat of some kind of jugglery or balance, because there is a bottle that is precariously perched on her head while she's holding other bottles in her hands. Maybe she's even juggling them, I don't know. And there are a bunch of musicians behind her who are providing her musical accompaniment and a beat. But what's happening in the foreground, interesting as it is, seems only to be an excuse to provide this dazzling background in which an immense cityscape unfolds. There is a garden, followed by another garden, followed by another garden, in which we see blooming flowers and we see pleasure pavilions set behind high walls. We see canals filled with lotuses. And we see orchards and we see fountains. Most of the gorgeous pavilions are already set up with floor spreads and cushions, but nobody's sitting in them. And in fact, the painting is oddly unsettling, because as you look at different parts of the painting, you see all of these spaces that are made to be used and inhabited, almost all of which are empty of people. And it is only on one quiet side street in the background that you see a male horse rider and his attendants waiting patiently as the covered palanquins are probably bringing a group of women to a garden. And there is a kanat or a tent wall erected across the road, which is going to shield the women as they disembark from these curtained palanquins and walk towards the garden gate. In the far background, another universe unfolds. In fact, the distant landscape and the river and the land on the other side of the river is much busier. There's more activity here. We see bridges, we see boat traffic, we see sugarcane fields, we see Persian wheels drawing water, we see a man combating a water monster, and we even see a lion hunt. Now, I think you'll agree with me when I say that while the ostensible subject of this painting is an entertainment in the zanana of a palace, the real protagonist of this painting is space. And I feel I could spend hours exploring all the rooms and the niches and the gardens of this painting. But not everybody who has written about this painting has been appreciative of it. And in fact, Stuart Cary Welch, who is a great, great scholar of Mughal painting, who did so much to bring offbeat, unusual pictures to the notice of the scholarly world, had this to say about paintings like this. European scientific perspective struck Faizullah, the artist of this picture, with the force of a custard pie. Befuddled by its principles, but thrilled with their effect, he peppered the composition with different vanishing points, and he created a boundlessly staccato view of a Mughal heaven on earth. Now, in the center of this painting, as Stuart Cary Welch points out, Faizullah has signed his name. His name is right at the point of this archway that leads, in the words of Welch, into a tunnel of subterranean delights. Welch calls this a tunnel because the perspective is shifting here, because the archway seems to lead in an Alice in Wonderland way into another landscape altogether, which has its own river and its own further shore. So what is going on over here? We know hardly anything about who Faizullah was. We know hardly anything about him apart from a handful of paintings that are signed by him and a few others which we assume had some connection with him because they are so similar in their ambitious spatial scope. The painting that we have been looking at is in the Aga Khan collection in Toronto, but there is a painting which is very similar, which is in the Chester Beatty Library in Dublin, where we see a very similar dancer balancing a bottle for that very familiar princess sitting on the throne. The dance is set in a very similar scene, but this time the format of this painting is vertical, whereas the painting in Toronto was horizontal. But the idyllic landscape, which is composed of inviting pavilions and gardens as far as the eye can see, rivers on the far side, an emperor who we presume is on horseback, on elephant back, is riding towards a disturbing scene of a fortress being besieged. And we even see scattered on the plain the site of some bodies of fallen soldiers. There is another painting in a museum in Wisconsin, the Chazen Museum of Art, which is of a similar kind. And its idyllic foreground similarly contrasts with the figures in the deep background, because the people who are enjoying a musical concert in the foreground seem to be oblivious of an army in the background, which is walking out of a red fort. I think because of the barbican that is in front of the fort, this may be the fort of Delhi, and it looks as though there is an army that is leaving the Red Fort in Delhi in order to do battle here. There is a painting of this kind in the David collection in Copenhagen. And on the other hand, this painting seems to have more delicious pleasures in its foreground. For example, we see this lady having her feet tickled or massaged or caressed. And the only violence here seems to be in the background, centering around a threatening aquatic creature who seems to be ready to swallow a horseman while his friends are rushing to his aid. Oops, I beg your pardon. The contrast between the idyll in the foreground and the disturbance in the background is taken even further in the painting that we used for our invitation for this event, a painting that is now in the Cleveland Museum of Art, where we see frolicking women in the foreground, giving and taking pleasure in the pool inside the palace. Mehfils are taking place in the pavilions that are behind them. But in the far background, there is again a besieged fort with a huge staking army marching past the pleasure gardens over a bridge. And this time, the soldiers are wearing East India Company army uniforms, and the Badshah who had been on the elephant has now been replaced by a Sahib with a topi. Although the name of Faizullah is associated with many of these very elaborate terrace scene paintings, this interest in complex and layered architectural and topographical backgrounds is in fact seen in a huge range of images that must have been made by many artists apart from Faizullah. Here's a teaser slide to prepare you for more images that we are going to see today, which have similar deep backgrounds, some of which I'm going to discuss later on in this talk. And when we see enough of these paintings, we have to realize that they were not an occasional diversion for an artist, but they were a major preoccupation of the time that they were produced, which is from about 1760 to about 1780 in the kingdom of Awadh. Already from the 4 terrace scenes that we have seen in some detail, we can see a pattern in the way they are organized, in which the foreground gives us a bird's eye view of the charmed life that is being lived within the zenana of a palace, while in the far distance, we get a glimpse of the world outside the palace, which shows a life which is composed of labor and war and danger. Because this formula is repeated across the paintings, we realize that they belong to a developed genre which has established its own conventions and messages that are as layered as the buildings that they depict. So what are these paintings and what might their significance be? Why did this kind of evocation of deep space become so popular at this time? I'd really like to know. And though I may not be able to provide you any decisive answers today, I want to share with you my speculations about these. So now, if we return, having looked at these paintings a little carefully, if we return to the words of Stuart Cary Welch, who is often a most astute observer, it seems to me that this time he gets his criticism of how the perspectives are erroneous in this painting. He gets his criticisms wrong. I cannot believe that imitating Western style perspective was the intention of this genre of painting. Instead, I think that these paintings have appropriated the tools of perspective to convey space, and then they have used space to communicate certain messages which are given to us in visual codes about pleasure as well as danger, ease as well as difficulties of the time. And both of these messages had a lot to do with the complex circumstances that must have surrounded the artists who made these paintings and the patrons for whom these paintings were made. So what was the context in which these paintings were produced? All of these paintings are believed to have been made in Awadh in the 1760s, 1770s, perhaps till 1780. This is some decades after the Mughal center has weakened. The very feeble emperors who have followed Aurangzeb on the Mughal throne have not been able to keep the empire together. And a number of provinces that had been under governors that served the Mughal emperor have now become sovereign nations in all but name, and their governors have become kings in all but name. So Mughal provinces like Bengal, like Awadh, like Hyderabad, now are governed by people who are given names like Nizams or Nawabs, which make them ministers or governors, but they actually have all the rights and all the powers of an independent sovereign. As these former provinces or subas grow in power, the tribute that would have gone to the central exchequer stays with them. And this creates pockets of regional wealth. So these are called the provincial Mughal kingdoms, and they continue to offer some sort of symbolic respect, tribute to the Mughal center, and yet they do not actually share their wealth or have any kind of performance of full obedience to the imperial center. Yet, the cultural forms that are associated with the Mughal center, the style of Mughal architecture, Mughal art, literature, music, courtly behavior, dress, jewelry, all of these continue to carry such prestige that the provincial Mughal kingdoms, instead of breaking away from the Mughal cultural idioms and saying we're going to form our own distinctive regional style, to a large extent, dedicate all of their resources and their energies to reproducing the Mughal ambiance in their own spheres. And this is why now there is a kind of a revision in the way historians speak about the 18th century, where the 18th century earlier used to be spoken of very disparagingly as a time of decline when the Mughal Empire faded away. It is now seen as a time of efflorescence, where the decentralization of power actually allowed multiple centers of patronage to arise, offering multiple opportunities all over the subcontinent for the artists and the poets and the dancers and the musicians and other kind of creative persons. So rather than being seen as a period of a loss of political power, the 18th century is now seen as a period of cultural gain for India. Now, to be cultured, a person had to be a connoisseur of music and gems and poetry and painting. A person had to have a fine library that was stocked with very well-made books. And therefore, the rulers now of these provincial Mughal kingdoms established artists' workshops in each of these centers, which continued and extended the tradition that had once started at the Mughal court. Awadh had been one of the most prosperous subas of the empire because it sat at the heart of the fertile agrarian lands between the Ganga and the Yamuna. And it also commanded the waterways where boat traffic carried a lot of the internal trade. In 1722, the governance of the Suba was given to Saadat Khan, who was an Iranian warrior in Mughal service. And although he was given a position of Nawab Wazir, which in theory is an appointment that is given by the Mughal emperor, in practice, it became a hereditary title that passed through generations of his family. Saadat Khan was followed by his son-in-law, Safdarjung. Safdarjung was followed by Shujauddaulah. Shujauddaulah was followed by Asaf-ud-Daulah, and so on and so forth, all the way till the dynasty ends with the unfortunate removal of Wajid Ali Shah from the throne. Now, in the 1760s and 1770s, when our terrace scenes were made, Shujauddaulah was on the throne of Awadh, and the capital was at Faizabad. It's later, under Shujauddaullah's son, Asaf-ud-Daulah, that the capital shifts to Lucknow. We know that artists from the Mughal court had flocked to Awadh since the 1740s, well before Shujauddaullah's reign, just after Nadir Shah's invasion had rocked Delhi. The terrace scenes that we are looking at are the product of a second generation of artists, artists whose parents would have come to Awadh from Delhi and who brought with them all the training and the finesse of Mughal painting, which they now used to please and flatter the new patrons that they had found in the East. The Nawabs of Awadh poured their resources into Faizabad and then into Lucknow. And one of the features of the time is the rapid urbanization of the area, where cities were laid out and magnificent buildings and gardens were made in them. Historians speak about how both Shujauddaulah and Asaf-ud-Daulah set about altering the face of the land over here. The skyline began to change. There was the arrival of fortresses, palaces, mausolea. Perhaps these paintings are recording this reality of a rapidly transforming urban scape. If we look at the cityscape here, we do notice how, despite the profusion of trees and flowers, so natural elements here, it is all kept within a very ordered, contained, geometrically aligned, urbanized space. So on this side of the river, broad streets all meet each other at right angles. Everything that is natural is ordered into neat beds in gardens or neat rows of trees in orchards. And each structure in this sprawling urban scape is a place for pleasure or leisure. There are terraces, there are pavilions, there are gazebos, while everything that is connected with work, like agricultural fields, or disorder, like empty, untamed land, or any other kind of construction which is connected with anything but pleasure, like a mosque or a fort or a tomb or a well, places of worship, education, defensive structures, mausolea for the dead, all of these kinds of things that are not connected to pleasure, all of them are shown relegated to the further shore. The urban density that is shown in these paintings, the way in which every inch of space is ordered and tamed, seems to me to stand in very stark contrast to the painting that is made by the same Awadhi artists, in which that Awadhi artist is imagining a scene of Delhi, of the zenana of the Mughal emperor of the 1730s, Muhammad Shah Rangila. So he's imagining the mother, the wife, and other members of the zenana of the Mughal emperor going for a picnic. So he's imagining, sitting in Lucknow in the in Faizullah in 1760s, he's creating an image which is imagining a Delhi of the 1730s. And in this imaginary scene of the zenana of Muhammad Shah going on a picnic, we see the women arriving by boat at a garden. The mother of Muhammad Shah is very strangely shown riding a bullock, while another royal woman on the right, who resembles a portrait of one of the wives of Muhammad Shah, Uddam Bhai, sits quite unaccountably near what looks like a puddle without any sign of a carpet or a throne spread out for her. In the background, we see an all-woman team assembling a tented enclosure around the garden that they're going to go to. And although the garden seems to be set within some sort of an architectural context, where there are these high wall structures with towers inside them, the space in which the garden is set is very desultory. The angle that is chosen by the artist shows these attractive buildings and it shows these elegant gardens, but they are set in a context of mud and puddles and sand. And this is quite unlike the image of a perfectly regulated, completely controlled space, which is shown in the Awadhi terrace scenes. In a recent essay, the scholar Nicholas Roth has placed the paintings of this Awadhi terrace scene type side by side with poetry that was produced in that place and at that time. And it turns out that when the poetry describes architecture, it describes palaces, it describes gardens, the poetry is very hyperbolic. It's full of lavish praise for what the buildings are like, what the palaces are like, and what the gardens are like. But they're also highly imprecise because they don't help us to reconstruct what the architecture was like, because it speaks of buildings as though they are as high as mountains or as though pavilions are light as bubbles. Painting, on the other hand, has to be precise, because if the artist has to place a roof on top of a column, he has to make a decision about the shape and the proportions of the column, whether it is ornamented or whether it is plain. But as another scholar who has studied this period, Chanchal Dadlani, shows in her essay, painting can be very, very precise, but it can be totally inaccurate, because at this time she also finds that when she looks at paintings that are supposed to be documentation of buildings that were made in Awadh, a lot of the artists show the buildings as being more ornamented than they really were. So it's like the artists also want to make the building seem better, more elaborate, more intricate than the actual structures were. Clearly, Awadhi cities were developing, they were undergoing transformations at this time, but they didn't quite look as orderly and as fully accomplished as the painting on the left would lead us to behave. And in fact, poets who migrated from Delhi to Lucknow actually bemoaned the loss of the great city that they had left behind. The poet Mir Taqi Mir says that the ruins of Delhi were far better than the buildings of Lucknow, and he rued the madness that had brought him there. Another poet who made a similar migration, Mir Hassan, said of Lucknow, each lane is so narrow here that even the wind cannot pass through. The sludge in the lanes is black with mud, like sweat from the body of an Ethiopian. These poets are critical of the new cities of Awadh, but the painters render images of dizzying perfection. Kind of a dissonance between the image that is created by painters and the image that is created by poets of Awadh at this time. And it's a dissonance that deserves to be explored. And the only suggestion that I have that might explain it now is a kind of an obvious explanation, which is that words are cheap. Words are much cheaper to produce than paintings. And so a poet can make an acerbic comment about a city or a place he has come to for his own personal writing, which he is not going to share with a potential patron. Whereas the painters whose paintings take months to make, which use expensive materials, painters need patrons and buyers to sustain them. And so the paintings will always aggrandize their patrons, though they might actually aggrandize them at the expense of their former patrons, making the previous dynasties look not so good compared to the splendors of their current patrons. And I think that is what is happening in this contrast that we see of a painter's depiction of the Awadh that he is living in now and his depiction of the Delhi that he has left behind, which suggests to us that the Awadh of the 1760s is far grander than the Delhi of the 1730s could ever hope to be. Now, the contrast between these two paintings actually brings to my mind genres of poetry that can be called a poetry of place. Descriptions of cities and regions often formed a very important part of Persian and Urdu narrative poems or masnavis. Sometimes these elaborate descriptions in poetry were used just to set the scene for a particular fictional character or an event to take place. Sometimes they described the journeys that were undertaken by the protagonists. So they often, because of these narrative reasons, gave us very extensive descriptions of landscapes and of urban settings as well. But these descriptions are often very formulaic, where every garden is as beautiful as the Garden of Eden, and every palace is lofty and kisses the clouds in the sky. But real places, and particularly real cities, come to the fore in a genre of poetry called the Shehr-e-Shub. This is a genre of narrative poetry in which a city is described at length, a particular city. And as the scholar Sunil Sharma tells us, at first, Shehr-e-Shubs are very entertaining poems. They were meant to be amorous, they were meant to be even bawdy, they could be humorous, because they would describe the city's charms in terms of all the lovely people who lived there. Later, the Shehr-e-Shub became a more courtly genre, and it started praising the city, and through it, it started praising its ruler, who was responsible for the magnificence of the city. Later still, the Shehr-e-Shub changed again. In a Delhi that had been ravaged by Nadir Shah's invasion and many subsequent invasions that followed, the genre was inverted. And the poetry of the Shehr-e-Shub became a poetry of lament that described the people, the neighborhoods, and the buildings of the city that now lay in ruins. So the contrast again between these two paintings, as we see Awadhi artists alluding to different ways of remembering and describing different cities and places, could also be a kind of a gesture towards the changing nature of the Sherashub, where the poem of praise becomes a poetry of lament. Now, the great terrace scenes, these paintings of Faizabad, seem to be actually contemporary with very great building projects that had been initiated by Shujauddaulah. In 1765, he embarked on a very huge, extensive building campaign in Faizabad. He knocked down the whole of the old citadel and he decided to make very tall, grand buildings in its place. He defined a 2-square-mile area around the citadel, and he told all his officers and his noblemen to build their houses there. And he made city walls that were no less than 2 meters thick. So a bullock cart could actually drive on top of the wall. The fine houses that surrounded the citadel were made of white lime. They were decorated with frescoes and gold paint. But even these grandest houses only were like a pale imitation of the Mughal palaces that were made of marble. These buildings in Awadh, beautiful as they were made of a less permanent material of lime and brick. But even these buildings, which seemed like softer imitations of Mughal palaces, were a huge improvement on what had gone before. Because 40 years earlier, when the first Nawab of Awadh, Sadaf Khan, had come as the governor, he had pitched his tent on the sides of the Ghagra River, and he had said, I'm going to settle a city here, Faizabad. And after a few days in the tent, his historian tells us, he decided to have a bungalow constructed, something more permanent than the tent for him to pass the monsoon. And this bungalow was just a wooden hut with a thatched roof. And around this, he built an enclosure of a mud wall. And then this enclosure housed the stables and the cavalry and the artillery and the infantry. And then the harem apartments were made nearby, also out of mud. And the lesser members of the population lived in what was essentially a mix of tents and thatch roof structures. Right? So basically, the city of Faizabad actually begins as a set of mud and thatch buildings. It comes as a kind of a shock for us when we look at a history of urbanism in Mughal India to realize that it was actually totally routine for Mughal noblemen to live in this kind of provisional building for much of their lives. A French traveler in Aurangzeb's time observes that very few of even the richest people in Mughal India built their houses out of brick or stone. Most of them built houses of clay with straw roofs. When we read articles that are on urbanization or on domestic architecture in 17th century Mughal India, we find that even the houses of the wealthy were surprisingly unimpressive. Kathy Asher, the architectural historian, tells us how rarely Mughal nobles made any grand structures for themselves in the provinces where they were posted right through the 16th and the 17th century, because there was a deliberate policy of transferring them frequently so that they never really struck roots in any one place and they never developed strongholds of their own from which they could challenge the central authority. So governors who actually had the audacity to make grand structures for themselves were actually punished by the great Mughals. And Asher tells us that Mughal mansabdars who had secure land holdings were only the Rajputs who had struck alliances with the Mughals and who may have been appointed as governors of various Mughal provinces, but were also allowed to retain their traditional kingdoms as a kind of a jagir, which they had a permanent control on. Because these Rajputs had a permanent hold over their ancestral lands, even if the reigning Rajput never actually lived there because he spent his whole life fighting battles for the Mughals at different frontier territories, they still had the resources and the security to invest in building in their Watan Jagirs, as they were called. And that explains why today, when we travel as tourists in North India, we see in Rajasthan so many imposing forts and beautiful palaces that have sections that date back from the 14th century, 15th century, 16th century, 17th century, 18th century. There's a continuous spectrum of building in these. Whereas when we go to a place that came under Mughal control directly, like Gwalior, for instance, the major palatial buildings that we see there either date back to before Mughal takeover or after Mughal decline. The work of Ebba Koch, another great architectural historian, adds some more details to our understanding of the uneven development of architecture under the Mughals, because she explains the system of property rights under the Mughals, where technically nothing was owned by any of the Mughal noblemen, except for the Rajputs, who had a permanent lien on their ancestral territories. Everything that was owned by anybody, however mighty, was actually property that they had by the mercy of the king. And when the nobleman died, his property all reverted to the Mughal emperor, who could choose to give it back to the dead nobleman's descendants or choose to keep it for himself. Since the ownership of property was so insecure, it actually discouraged any investment in these properties. And so Koch's work tells us that it is only tombs that were exempt from this rule, because it would have been very ignoble for the king to confiscate land on which a tomb had been built. And so building tombs on family estates actually became a way of securing property for a lot of the Muslim noblemen. And this ended up with a lot more resources being poured into the architecture for the dead rather than the architecture for the living. By the late 18th century, the power of the Mughal emperor had waned. The balance of power had shifted and had even become inverted. And the emperor was the one who was anxiously hoping that he still had the support of his provincial governors. The governorates, in turn, practically became hereditary kingdoms, and the development of these provincial Mughal dynasties ushered in an era of settled confidence. And this became expressed in a flourishing of architecture where cities grew, and along with public works like bridges and canals and hospitals and places of worship and sarais, the de facto sovereigns of the provincial Mughal states began to build extensive palaces and gardens for themselves. So crucially for us, this then gets expressed in the paintings that are made at the time, which represent the architecture that is coming up in these places. Paintings that delight in space, that celebrate urban vistas, that multiply what may actually have been just a handful of palaces or havelis and turn them into a huge multitude in these endless prospects in these paintings. These kinds of vistas are seen not just in Awadh, as we have been seeing, but practically everywhere else. If we look at the other provinces or former provinces of the Mughal states, we encounter this same interest in rendering deep landscapes and vast vistas and immense palatial complexes. Maybe it's not carried to the same dizzying extent as we see in Awadh, but we see this in Hyderabad, where this painting comes from, which is very similar in spirit to the Awadhi terrace scene. There's an absolutely symmetrical garden which looks onto a river, in which a rather European town is shown sitting upon the Deccani plain. Then there's this painting, also from Hyderabad, which is a fabulous scene showing Asaf Jah II going with his entourage from Hyderabad to the Golconda Fort. So if in the previous painting, the city in the distance looked like something from a European painting, in this miniature, the sense of a particular place is captured not just in the way it accurately reflects the architecture of the Golconda Fort, but also in the way it reflects the fabulous rock formations of the region, as was pointed out by Navina Haider in a fabulous lecture she gave recently. In Hyderabad, we also have the fantastic manuscript of the Tuzuki Asafia that relates the rule of Asaf Jah II, which has this incredibly detailed view of Hyderabad. The Nizam is shown at the center receiving a French visitor in his palace, while the teeming city around him prominently shows the Shia shrines that are now able to flourish under his protection. So in Hyderabad, in Awadh, in Murshidabad, the autonomy that is brought about by the 18th century ushers in a new era of urban development, and the deep vistas that are shown here, the rolling landscapes, the infinitely extending towns, don't simply reflect the growing wealth and the increasing urbanization of these places and their ambitious architectural projects, but they also express a new kind of relationship with space, with place, with territory, whether they are based on a capturing of the realities of the topography, like the granitic rocks of the Deccan near Hyderabad, or whether they are based on the fantastical imaginings of an infinitely stretched pleasure garden, as in Awadh. This impulse to make a territory visible, to turn it into a set of recognizable motifs, must have been a conscious project on the part of the painters and the patrons alike, as they were very conscious of being at the heart of the creation of new centers in what had earlier been provincial margins of the empire. So this is a project of placemaking in which the actual architectural achievements on the ground are celebrated, but are likely also exaggerated and maybe even anticipated, because the representations of painting probably raced ahead of the facts on the ground, presenting to viewers the vision of a perfect cityscape that has already been achieved, when the actual city was probably a place full of piles of building material and dust and architectural intentions rather than achieved facts. Now, given the way in which architectural representation in painting and the creation of a place as a distinct center at the heart of a territory is intertwined, should we really be surprised to find that in those Rajput territories, which had exercised sovereignty over their lands much before the provincial Mughal governors did, this celebration in painting of the achievements that were there in brick and stone, the great buildings that the Rajputs were making, they were being celebrated in paintings much earlier. If we go to the south of Rajasthan to Mewar in Udaipur, we see these fabulous large-scale topographical paintings that have begun being produced much earlier in the 18th century. The earliest may actually date to 1700, right at the start of the 18th century. And it's followed by such a dense sequence of large-scale, intensely observed, carefully worked paintings of real places that scholars can actually trace year by year additions and alterations to the palace structure. For example, I'm going to show you two paintings that were made in Udaipur from 1700 and 1705. And the architectural historian Shikha Jain shows how real architectural changes, such as the addition of a Mughal garden next to the palace, is meticulously recorded by the artist of the 1705 painting. So this kind of documentation of the unfolding work of architecture in Udaipur is something that continues fabulously through Udaipur from the start of the 18th century all the way into the photographic age. Mewar's vision of architecture and space is one of the most fascinating chapters in the history of Indian painting. Its interest in specific places and architecture make buildings dominate the image, and yet the compositional and iconographical techniques that the artist uses often turns the building into a kind of a mandala where, despite the prominence of the architecture, the ruler remains prominent within it. In cases like this, the composition actually helps to turn the building into an emanation of the royal who lives within it. This is rather different from Awadh, where the buildings actually dwarf the human figures that move among them. Painting in Udaipur has a very unique take on space and on architecture and on topography. But other Rajput kingdoms also show an interest in exploring deep space, and they celebrate their palaces in their own ways. So when a prominent artist from the atelier of Muhammad Shah Rangila, who is shown on the left, made by Dalchand, we have a painting made for Muhammad Shah Rangila in Delhi. When the artist of this painting arrives in Jodhpur, he produces for his new patron, Maharaja Abhay Singh, a flattering portrait that reproduces the exact format of the painting that he had made for the Mughal emperor. But where he had placed the Mughal emperor on a carpet, he makes the Rajput Maharaja sit on a golden throne, and he makes sure that he makes the Rajput ruler's courtyard bigger with glimpses of a large garden beyond the gateway. He makes sure he has twice as many entertainers and attendants than the Mughal emperor had in the painting that was made for him. Marwar's interest, Jodhpur's interest in space, was to take many different forms in the succeeding decades, from the vast panoramic paintings of the Ramcharitmanas and the Durga Charit that were made later for Vijay Singh, to the rather Mewar-like, very crystalline depictions of palace and temple scenes under Maharaja Man Singh as late as the early 19th century. My little excursion into the way in which Rajput schools show space and place would be incomplete without also making a foray towards Kishangarh, where again, artists who had immigrated from the Mughal court transferred the vocabulary of Mughal painting, this time to devotional themes rather than to royal ones. In Kishangarh, one of the first things that an important Mughal artist does on arriving there is to make a Rukmini Mangal series about the wedding of Krishna and Rukmini. But this Rukmini Mangal series could have been mistaken for a Shahjahani painting had we not noticed the blue-skinned god sitting in the courtyard. Just compare the far background of this scene where Krishna has amassed armies outside his palace for the battle that is about to come, with the background of this scene from a Padshahnama, the book of Shah Jahan's biography. This is really, really close to the Mughal idiom. Later, of course, Kishangarhi painting will develop a stylized character in which a royal-looking Radha and Krishna will be seen on marble terraces and among marble pavilions, rather than in the pastures and meadows of the cowherds. There will be a double appropriation here, where Mughal-style vistas will show the kind of palaces and Mughalized architecture that the Kishangarhi royals made for themselves, and then the painter will offer these up to Radha and Krishna, who then are dressed in the garb of Kishangarhi royals, collapsing the imperial and the provincial, the royal and the divine into a single entity. This quick tour that I've tried to give you of space and architecture in Mewar and Marwar and Kishangarh shows how some of the qualities that we associate with provincial Mughal painting were seen already several decades earlier in the Rajput domains. Here, a celebration of the region's fine buildings gave us a visual vocabulary that turned the landscape into a kind of a logo, which became a shorthand. Oh, this is Udaipur. Oh, this is Kishangarh. But I can't resist a final turn in the Rajput realm to remind us of the popularity of vast palaces in places or made for people that probably didn't have anything like the grand circumstances that are rendered in the images. I'm sure everyone in this audience knows the work of Nansuk, this very, very celebrated Pahari painter, particularly the works that came out of his close relationship with his patron Raja Balwant Singh, seen here watching the monsoon clouds from the terrace of a palace. But we know from history that Balwant Singh was a lesser nobleman with a very small estate. Nansuk's paintings show him in vast palaces that he never had. So the painted architecture here becomes not a document of what Balwant Singh had, but perhaps it becomes a fantasy of what he wished for. A generation later, Nansuk's descendants would transpose literary subjects of the Ramayana of Nal Damayanti into immense Mughalized palaces, the like of which didn't really exist in the Pahari states. Now, one could argue that the extensive depiction of architecture in Mewar or Marwar or Kishangarh or Kangra answer different needs from the extensive spaces that are depicted in Awadh or Murshidabad or Hyderabad. But I'm coming to think that maybe there is an error in the way we think about one in the context of Persian poetry and historical circumstances, and another in the context of myth and legend. Because if we were to continue to think of both of these representations of architecture coming from different contexts and different worldviews, we would continue to confine the provincial Mughal to an Islamicate realm, and we would continue to confine the Rajput into a Hindu mythological realm, whereas we know that in reality, Rajput and Mughal worlds were very closely intertwined. And Rajput and Shia and Sunni Mansabdars actually served the Mughal armies together. They lived in the same encampments and they looked at each other, often, I'm sure, with competition and envy. And so when we look at 18th century provincial Mughal states and we see their adoption of courtly splendor, I think it is a mistake to only imagine that they are wanting to imitate their Mughal overlords, because partly perhaps they are also playing a kind of a catch-up game also with their Rajput neighbors who have already been enjoying a sovereignty over their holdings that the Mughal governors are only just beginning to grasp. Let me turn now to the disturbing details that I had briefly shown you in the background of some of the Awadhi terrace scenes. This detail that we are looking at, which is from this painting of a dancer balancing a bottle on her head, this detail of a fortress under siege has a rather striking resemblance to a scene from the Padshah-nama, which was the grand imperial manuscript that was illuminated and illustrated for a text that dealt with the life and reign of Shah Jahan. If we look at the detail from the Awadhi painting on the right and we compare it with the detail on the left from the Padshah-nama painting, we see the crumpled bodies on the low rise of the hill. We see the cannon fire assaulting a fort, which seem to have strong resemblances to each other. We could look at another painting from the Padshah-nama, which is the siege of another fortress, and feel that perhaps this was the source for the conical fortress on the hill that is being surrounded by cannon fire. The resemblances cannot be accidental. This conical fortress on the hill, the ring of cannons, the fallen soldiers, seem to be deliberately picking elements of Pachanama paintings and combining them into motifs that are repeated across the Awadhi terrace scenes. When we look at these in conjunction with each other, we should put aside our judgments about the quality of the drawing and the brushwork and just see the motifs for the way they travel from one image to the next. And we should remember that the manuscript of the Pachanama itself was in Awadh at this time and would be later gifted by an Awadhi Nawab to the British monarch in 1799. What is it that makes this scene of sieges a kind of repeated motif which is seen across these paintings time and time and time again? We see these disturbing images in the backgrounds of scenes of entertainers on terraces, ladies bathing in pools, this scene of a lady having her feet massaged, a musical concert, this scene which includes a depiction of Laila and Majnu in the background beyond the palace walls. Now, to try and understand these repeated references to warfare that I was seeing in these paintings, I tried to make a list of the major invasions that hit the Mughal capital at this time. We hear so much about the invasion of Nadir Shah in 1739, but just look at the situation 10 years after that. There followed a period of almost continual attack by the Afghans, the Jats, the Rohillas, the Marathas, the British. This is a list that is Delhi-centric. It revolves around attacks on Delhi, but the Nawabs of Awadh were still attempting to defend the Mughal center. And very often, when they found themselves on the losing side of almost all of these battles, they often suffered penalties after the inevitable defeat. Then, in 1759, something more startling happened. The reigning Mughal monarch at Delhi was assassinated by his own vizier, who put a puppet on the throne. And the Mughal crown prince had to escape to Awadh, where he was recognized as the rightful heir to the Mughal throne, but he was unable to return to Delhi for 13 years. So for 13 years, he was in Awadh, using the fort of Allahabad as his base. And the Nawabs of Awadh were endlessly involved in battles and political intrigues and negotiations on his behalf. So surely the tremors of the time have traveled across the earth and across the river and have snaked under the foundations of these fantastical palaces to make themselves felt on every pavilion and every terrace that is depicted here. The wonder is that the besieged fortress and the lumbering armies are shown as far away as they are by these artists, because the activities that these scenes of siege denote would have concerned everybody in Awadh, whether they were king or commoner, because they had the potential of erupting into everybody's lives. These marvelous terrace scenes are actually made precisely during the time that the Mughal prince Ali Gauhar, who will be the future Shah Alam, is in Awadh. And the reference to sieges makes sense, as do some of the distant processions which show an emperor on elephant back, or this scene of a lion hunt, which was an imperial privilege. They make sense because the emperor was present in Awadh, marching, campaigning, importuning, hunting, being hosted and feasted at Awadh, even as Awadh was trying to test the limits of its independence from him. An ironical commentary on this peculiar situation is actually supplied by this painting, which shows a typically Awadh terrace scene in the foreground with the fort of Delhi lumbering on the further shore. What does it mean? The scene is peaceful. There isn't a siege or a battle. The figures that are on the bank of the river, which you can see a little more clearly in the detail on the right, are performing entertainments for what must be a figure of an emperor who is seated in that domed pavilion in the center. This was called the Shah Burj, and it was the place where emperors from Shah Jahan onwards had shown themselves to the people in Jharoka Darshan. Yet, even though there is a figure occupying the Shah Burj, which must be the emperor, it has no halo around it. And the fort and the ruler are occupying the position within these paintings of the real world and the place that is filled with problems. The problems like this genre likes to push into the distance. I'd like to end today's exploration of these paintings by looking at the way this kind of palatial and architectural imagery was actually produced in Lucknow or in Faizabad at more or less the same time for patrons beyond the Nawabs. We've already seen how the paintings that we have been looking at exist in multiple copies of very, very similar compositions. And this suggests that they were not being made just for one ruler, but for many different takers for the image. So perhaps there were many patrons, perhaps there was even a free market and artists would produce these expecting that someone or the other will come along and buy them up. They could have also been made in a court workshop to be gifted by the Nawab to others, which also then suggests that in Awadh there were multiple collectors who would have been very happy to receive them. But elite circles in Awadh at this time included also a number of Europeans who were either in the Nawab's service or in the service of the East India Company. And they too were collectors and commissioners of painting. This painting that we are looking at is by the visiting European art Johann Zoffany, and it shows a circle of very prominent Europeans in Lucknow in the 1780s. But already in Faizabad, a number of Europeans had entered the service of the Nawab, and two of them are of particular interest for art historians. The first of whom is a French gentleman called Jean-Baptiste Gentil. Gentil was a military man. He began by serving the French East India Company in South India, but in 1763, he was hired by Shujā-ud-Dawla to modernize his army and to raise a battalion for Awadh. He also had the position of being an official agent of King Louis XVI in Awadh. And Gentil hoped that his presence in Awadh would help to increase French influence in North India. So he tried to observe and compile information about everything that he saw, to send back information to France about the political situation, about Indian history, and about Indian manners and customs. These he was putting into books that he wrote, and he hoped that it would inspire the French king to order the French to invest more in their Indian connection. From 1763 to about 1775, Gentil remained in the service of Shujā-ud-Dawla, and he wrote books on Indian history and customs. You're seeing the manuscript of one of his books on the right. These books were illustrated for him by two artists who worked for him for the 12 years that he was stationed at Faizabad, one of whom was actually the son of a fine Mughal painter who had come from the court of Muhammad Shah. Among the illustrated works that he commissioned from these artists was an atlas of the Mughal Empire, in which maps of the Mughal subas are framed by vignettes of local flora and fauna and customs and legends. And these themselves derive from older Mughal images. An album that is made for Gentil has a page which shows a Mughal emperor on a peacock throne that had long been taken away by Nadir Shah. If the artist who made this had inherited Mughal training, we can see how much he has adapted his compositional format in order to miniaturize the emperor and make his things more important than the man. Here, the various accoutrements are no longer connected to the king or become reflections of his magnificence. They are magnificent in themselves. There is also a diagrammatic representation in this album of the kinds of servants who were present at court and the kind of panoply that surrounded the emperor, all of which get disconnected from the person of the emperor himself. And even Jontil's own involvement in the affairs of Awadh are painted in the same manner as though they were part of a scientific diagram rather than of an image which is meant to record and glorify the patron. An even more interesting European figure in Faizabad at the time was Colonel Antoine Polier, who was a French-Swiss army man and military engineer who had been in the service of the East India Company, and he got a reputation for being a very good architect of forts. When Shuja'ud-Dawla requested the British East India Company for a qualified engineer, Polier was sent to him, where he was appointed the chief architect and engineer, and he helped design buildings and fortifications. He also got involved in cartographic surveys, and he offered advice for the military as well. Both of these men, Polier and Jontil, entered very high Nawabi circles. They lived like white Mughals. And Polier's professional expertise in many ways lay entirely within the domain of the visual, because he was a designer of buildings and fortifications. He was a surveyor. He was a map maker. And perhaps that explains why Polier's collection of paintings and albums are some of the finest that were assembled at the time. This is one of the paintings that was made for one of Polier's albums, and the quality of the workmanship is much higher than anything we see made for Jontil. But it is the paintings that are made for him by his own atelier that carry the visual logic of those crazy Awadhi terrace scenes to their logical extreme. We see here buildings and cultivated landscapes that become the entire raison d'etre of the works. They are evacuated of human presence, or when figures appear, they are like little ants that are dwarfed by buildings, while the eye takes all of its pleasure from the sheer immensity of space. The paintings that Polier commissioned were either already very well liked, people had a taste for them, or he knew that they would be appreciated because he had multiple copies made of some of them, which he gave as gifts to important and powerful people. Polier fell out of favor in Awadh for helping Shah Alam too much. And so he left the Nawab and he got employed directly by the Mughal monarch. And when the Mughal monarch was finally able to return to Delhi, Polier accompanied him. The scholar of late Mughal painting, Yutika Sharma, has written very insightfully of the paintings of this moment of return. And the paintings that she discusses are now in the Victoria and Albert Museum. They were probably made not commissioned by the newly reinstated Mughal emperor, but probably commissioned by Polier. In this painting, we see Shah Alam's entourage winding its way to Delhi, whose citadel is rendered in great detail in very delicate tints. The second painting that Yutika Sharma discusses in this context is a very well-known, very idealized view of the Red Fort of Delhi, which takes that famous Shah Burj at the center in the foreground, and then unfolds the rest of the Red Fort with an unreal symmetry, to produce which the actual details of the architecture of the fort had to be edited and changed around. But in this painting, I find this detail that is heart-stopping. Sorry, I've made a little mistake here. Just look at the detail on the right, which is from this painting. Can you see my pointer? If you can see my pointer, it's here, this detail. It's a detail that shows Shah Alam preparing to step into the Diwan-e-Khas, according to Yutika Sharma, for the first time after his long exile. And one wonders about the mentality of the artist for whom the allure of space, the allure of sweeping vistas from a bird's eye perspective could take precedence over the highlighting of this momentous event. What a distance we have traveled from the days of Shah Jahan, when paintings were scaled to show the emperor dominating the grand darbar hall that he had built. What should we be reading into this image but that the very fact of the miniaturization of the king in this painting tells us something about the dwindling significance of the Mughals as anything but the producers in the past of fine buildings and works of art and sources of visual pleasure, which is all that poor Shah Alam remains. I'll end here and I thank you for your attention.